My stepmother told the wedding planner I wasn't real family. She said it quietly, the way people say cruel things they hope won't be repeated. I was standing 3 feet away, holding a clipboard with the seating chart on it. She didn't know I heard her. She also didn't know that in 11 months, I would be the reason her marriage ended. Not with tears, not with shouting, but with a folder of bank statements and a very calm voice. That day, though, I just wrote her name at a table far from mine and said nothing. My name is Emily Hartwell. I'm a forensic accountant, which means I spend my days finding money that people don't want found. It's not glamorous. It's patient work, the kind nobody notices until it's too late for them to hide anything. I learned it from watching my mother keep my father's company books for 22 years before cancer took her. I never thought I'd use those skills on my own family, but grief makes people reckless, and my father was about to become the most reckless man I'd ever met. Richard Hartwell, my father, built a construction and property company from a single truck and a business loan. He was steady, careful, the kind of man who read contracts twice. After my mother died, that steadiness cracked. He stopped sleeping in their bedroom. He started eating dinner standing up over the sink, like sitting down at the table alone was too much to face. I'd stop by some evenings just to make sure he'd eaten something besides toast. I didn't know yet that his loneliness would soon have a name, a smile, and an agenda. The first year after my mother's death was the hardest I'd ever watched him live through. He kept her reading glasses on the nightstand for months. He couldn't bring himself to donate her coats. I offered more than once to help him go through her things, and every time he said, "Not yet, Em. Give me a little more time." I gave him all the time he asked for. I didn't know that somewhere out there, someone else was watching a grieving, wealthy widower and calculating a very different kind of timeline. He met Vanessa Cole at a charity gala 14 months after the funeral, a fundraiser for a children's hospital wing, the kind of event where the guest list matters as much as the cause. She was 29, working as an event consultant, standing near the silent auction table when my father, uncomfortable in his tux and unsure what to do with his hands, wandered over to ask about a painting. She laughed at something he said. He told me later it was the first time he'd laughed without feeling guilty about it since my mother died. I want to be clear. Age gaps don't automatically mean anything sinister. What made me pause wasn't the math. It was the speed. 3 days after the gala, she texted him. A week later, dinner. 2 weeks after that, he mentioned her name so casually at breakfast that I almost missed it. And then he mentioned it again the next week. And the week after, until her name was simply part of his sentences, the way my mother's name used to be. 6 weeks after meeting her, my father was talking about a future. He described her as different, as someone who understood loneliness the way I do. I asked gentle questions, where she grew up, what she did before events, whether she had family nearby. His answers were vague, secondhand, filtered entirely through what she'd told him. I didn't push. I told myself it was early. I told myself grief makes people move fast sometimes, and that didn't automatically mean something was wrong. 12 weeks in, she'd moved into the house my mother decorated. I remember walking in one Sunday and seeing her perfume bottles lined up on my mother's old vanity and feeling something twist in my chest that I didn't have a clean word for. Not anger exactly. Displacement, like watching someone rearrange furniture in a room you thought was permanent. My father caught me staring and said quietly, almost defensively, she just needed somewhere to put her things. I nodded and said nothing. The way I would learn to do so often that year. The first time I met Vanessa properly, she hugged me before I'd even said hello, told me she'd heard so much about me, and then spent the rest of the dinner asking my father questions about the company. How many properties? What the annual revenue looked like, whether the business was diversified. She asked nothing about my mother. Nothing about how they'd met, decades earlier, or what she'd built. I chalked it up to nerves. I was wrong, but I wouldn't understand how wrong for months. By month 5, there was a ring, a large one, the kind chosen more for size than sentiment. I asked him to slow down once, just once. "You've known her 4 months," I said carefully, sitting across from him at his kitchen table. He looked at me like I'd suggested he stop breathing. "You don't understand what it's like to be alone in that house," he said. He wasn't wrong. I didn't know what that loneliness felt like. I only knew what my mother's handwriting looked like in the margins of the company ledgers. Grandma Joan, my father's mother, sharp at 81 and allergic to pretending, met Vanessa exactly once before the engagement and pulled me into the hallway afterward. "That girl asked me 3 questions in 20 minutes, she said. "What's the house worth? Does your son own the company outright? And do I get along with his daughter?" Not one question about him. I laughed it off at the time, telling her Vanessa was probably just nervous. Grandma Joan wasn't laughing. "Mark my words," she said. "Nervous people ask about the person. Calculating people ask about the assets." At the engagement dinner, Vanessa raised her glass and said, "To new beginnings, and closing old chapters." She was looking at me when she said it. My father laughed, thinking it was about grief. I understood it differently. I smiled anyway, because I'd already decided something important. I wasn't going to fight her with feelings. Feelings lose to a woman who cries on command. I was going to fight her if it ever came to that with facts. Facts don't have a soft voice you can talk over. Wedding planning moved almost as fast as the courtship had. Vanessa hired a planner within 2 weeks of the engagement, booked a venue that cost more than most people's annual salary, and began sending my father lists, florists, caterers, a band she simply had to have. I offered to help with the seating chart, mostly to stay close enough to watch. That's when I overheard the comment that started all of this, the one about me not being real family. I remember thinking, quite calmly, that I would remember that sentence for a very long time. The wedding happened 8 months after they met. It was beautiful, expensive, and paid for almost entirely by my father. Vanessa wore a dress that cost more than my first car, and during the ceremony she cried at exactly the right moments, in exactly the right way, in front of exactly the right people. I sat in the second row next to Grandma Joan, who squeezed my hand once during the vows and whispered, "Watch her face when the officiant mentions in sickness and in health." I watched. Vanessa's smile didn't change at all. During the reception, Vanessa pulled me aside, smiling for the cameras the whole time, and said, "I know this is hard for you, but it's time to let your father live his life without you hovering." I said nothing. I filed it away, the same way I file every strange comment a suspicious client makes before an audit, quietly and permanently. She didn't know that filing things away quietly was, professionally speaking, the single most dangerous thing you could do around me. Their honeymoon was 10 days in the Mediterranean, Santorini, then a stop in Positano, then Paris on the way back. My father sent photos, genuinely happy ones, and I was glad to see him smiling in them, even as I noticed the itinerary was almost entirely Vanessa's choosing. When they returned, he mentioned offhand that they'd extended the trip a little, and it had cost more than expected. I didn't think much of it at the time. Vacations run over budget. It would be months before I understood that particular pattern had only just begun. For the first few months of the marriage, I told myself I was overreacting. My father seemed happy. He laughed more. He took Vanessa on trips he'd never taken my mother on. Napa for a long weekend, Cabo twice, a second Mediterranean cruise before the first one's photos had even finished printing. I told myself people are allowed second chances at joy. I told myself this more than once, the way you repeat something you're trying hard to believe. Then I got a call from Marcus, my father's longtime bookkeeper, who'd known me since I was 12 years old and had taught me how to read a balance sheet at my mother's old desk. His voice was tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. He said, "There's some transfers I can't explain, and I don't want to bring it to your dad until someone else has eyes on it first. Can you take a look?" I told him I'd stop by that weekend, telling myself it was probably nothing. I told myself I'd just glance at the numbers as a favor to Marcus. One glance turned into an evening. One evening turned into a weekend. What I found wasn't catastrophic yet, just a pattern. A new LLC, registered 8 weeks after the wedding, receiving consulting fees from my father's company. $42,000 so far, spread across 3 separate payments, each one just under the amount that would trigger an automatic board notification. That detail alone told me whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing. The LLC's registered agent address was a UPS store 2 miles from our house. I didn't recognize the company name, Voss Strategic Consulting. I didn't recognize the owner's name either, at first. But I recognized the signature authorizing the payments on the very first invoice I pulled. It was Vanessa's handwriting, the same loose, confident cursive I'd seen on wedding cards and thank you notes for months. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with confirmation of something I'd already half suspected. I didn't say anything to my father right away. I know how that sounds, like I was hiding something from him. But I'd learned enough in my career to know that half-finished accusations get dismissed, especially when the accused is charming and the accuser is the daughter who never liked her. I needed the full picture before I said a single word. So I did what I do best. I started pulling threads, quietly, the way you'd defuse something instead of setting it off. Marcus and I built a shared file, encrypted, backed up in 3 places. Every transfer, every date, every signature. The consulting fees grew. $42,000 became $68,000 within 2 months. I cross-referenced the LLC with public business filings. The listed owner was a name I didn't recognize. Daniela Voss. It took one afternoon of searching public records to learn that Daniela Voss and Vanessa Cole shared the exact same home address before the wedding. Vanessa hadn't even bothered to use a fake middle name that would hold up under scrutiny. Around this same time, my father mentioned almost in passing at dinner that Vanessa had brought up starting a family soon. I remember setting down my fork very carefully. He looked hopeful in a way that made my chest ache. Hopeful the way he used to look when my mother was still alive. I asked him if they'd discussed it seriously. He said Vanessa had mentioned feeling a little off the week before, and that they were keeping an eye on things. I didn't say what I was thinking. Not yet. I sat with the LLC discovery for 3 days before I told anyone else. Not because I was afraid of Vanessa, because I was afraid of what it would do to my father. He'd already lost 1 wife. If I brought him proof his new one was quietly bleeding his company, I might lose him too. To denial, to anger at the messenger, to the version of grief that makes people cling harder to the thing that's hurting them. I needed more than a name match. I needed something he couldn't argue with. That's when the second problem appeared. Marcus called me on a Tuesday, sounding even more rattled than before. "There's someone in the parking lot most Thursday afternoons," he said. "Waiting for her. Younger guy, drives a black sedan. She gets in his car for almost an hour, sometimes longer. I asked him not to follow her, not to confront anyone, not to do anything except keep doing his job. I wasn't investigating a marriage. I was investigating a business relationship gone wrong. The marriage part just happened to be attached to it. I hired a licensed private investigator, someone the company had used before for legitimate vendor background checks. I told him exactly what I needed. Dates, times, locations. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal. 3 weeks later, I had a folder. Vanessa was meeting a man named Tyler Reyes at a coffee shop, then a hotel, every other Thursday. Tyler Reyes, it turned out, was also the operations consultant, listed as an authorized signer on the Daniela Voss LLC. The affair and the fraud weren't 2 separate problems. They were the same problem, wearing 2 different shirts. A week later, Vanessa mentioned to my father, in front of me, at Sunday dinner, with what I can only describe as theatrical timing, that she'd taken a pregnancy test and it had come back unclear, and that she wanted to see a doctor before saying anything further. My father's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in over a year. Grandma Joan, sitting across from me, caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. I wondered, not for the first time, whether unclear was doing a great deal of convenient work. I remember sitting in my car outside that hotel, watching the investigator's photos load on my phone, and feeling something I didn't expect. Not triumph, not even anger. Just tiredness. My mother used to say that people show you exactly who they are, you just have to be patient enough to watch. I'd been patient for nearly 8 months by then. I finally had enough to stop watching and start acting. But acting recklessly would only let Vanessa reframe the story as jealousy, or worse, as an attack during a possible pregnancy. I needed to be certain, and I needed my father to see it himself. Before I went to my father, I went to Mr. Alderman, our family attorney, who had drafted my father's prenuptial agreement, and I hoped drafted it well. He read through the file in silence, occasionally exhaling through his nose. When he finished, he looked up and said, "This isn't just a prenup violation. Depending on what the LLC actually did, or didn't do, for the company, this could be fraud. Wire fraud, if the transfers cross state lines, which they did." For the first time in weeks, I let myself feel something close to relief. Mr. Alderman explained the prenup clause my father insisted on, almost as an afterthought. Back when he still thought love needed a safety net. Any evidence of financial fraud or infidelity during the marriage would void Vanessa's rights to spousal support and any claim on the company. Vanessa had signed it without reading it closely, confident it would never matter. She'd been wrong twice. Once about being caught, and once about assuming my father's daughter would look away out of politeness. "There's one more thing," Mr. Alderman said before I left his office. "If she's using a pregnancy claim strategically, and I'm not saying she is, that changes the emotional calculus, but not the legal one. Fraud is fraud regardless of what else is happening in the marriage." I nodded, grateful someone had said it out loud. It didn't make what came next any easier. It just meant I finally had a floor to stand on instead of guessing in the dark. 2 weeks later, at my father's 62nd birthday dinner, a small gathering at his favorite restaurant, Vanessa stood up mid-meal to make an announcement. "I wanted to wait for the perfect moment," she said, smiling around the table. "But I think tonight's it. I'm pregnant." My father's face broke open with joy. The table erupted into congratulations. I smiled and clapped along with everyone else, my stomach in knots because I already knew from a quiet conversation with Marcus that Vanessa had canceled a scheduled doctor's appointment the week before without rescheduling. Grandma Joan cornered me in the restaurant. Bathroom minutes later. "You don't believe her," she said. It wasn't a question. I told her I didn't know what to believe yet, only that something about the timing, right as the LLC payments were getting larger, right as Marcus's questions were getting harder to deflect, felt less like joy and more like leverage. Grandma Joan gripped my hand. "Just don't wait so long that your father can't forgive himself for not seeing it sooner," she said. The same line she'd say to me again, weeks later, at her own kitchen table. The final piece of the financial puzzle fell into place 2 weeks after that birthday dinner. Marcus flagged a request from Vanessa's LLC for a much larger payment, $180,000, labeled as a brand consulting retainer for a rebrand project the company had never approved, never discussed in any meeting, and had no paperwork for beyond an invoice Vanessa had drafted herself. If that payment went through, it would have drained nearly the entire quarterly operating cushion. I told Marcus to hold the transfer using standard compliance review procedures. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would tip her off. 3 days after the transfer was quietly flagged, Vanessa announced, again at dinner, again with theatrical timing, that she'd lost the pregnancy, and that she needed everyone to be gentle with her for a while. My father was devastated. I felt something colder than grief settle into my chest, because Marcus had confirmed by then that no obstetrician's office in a 40-mile radius had any record of a Vanessa Cole or Vanessa Hartwell as a patient. I didn't say anything that night. I simply understood, with total clarity, exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. I finally called my father and asked him to come to my apartment, alone, on a Sunday morning, 2 weeks after the loss. He arrived expecting a casual brunch, still fragile from what he believed had been a genuine grief. I hated what I was about to do to him almost as much as I knew I had no choice but to do it. I set a folder on the table between us. "Before you say anything," I told him, "I need you to know I didn't go looking for this. It found me, through Marcus, through the books." I watched my father's face change page by page. First confusion, at the LLC name he didn't recognize. Then recognition, when he saw Vanessa's signature on the authorization forms. Then something harder to describe, a kind of quiet collapsing, when he reached the investigator's photographs. He didn't yell. He didn't cry, not right away. He just sat very still and said, "How long have you known?" I told him the truth, long enough to be sure, not long enough to be cruel about it. "Why didn't you tell me the moment you suspected something?" he asked, and there was real hurt in his voice, not just about Vanessa. I explained it plainly. If I'd come to him with a hunch and a bad feeling, Vanessa would have called it jealousy, and he would have believed her. Because that's what people in new love do. They believe the person in front of them over the person who loves them from a careful distance. I needed proof solid enough that no one could argue their way out of it. Then I told him the last part, the part I'd been dreading most. I explained as gently as I could that Marcus had confirmed no medical office in the area had any record of Vanessa as a patient, pregnant or otherwise, and that the timing of both the pregnancy and the loss lined up almost exactly with the financial pressure points I'd flagged for compliance review. My father closed his eyes. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. Then quietly he said, "She used our grief. She used my grief for my wife to buy herself time. My father asked for one night before deciding what to do. I gave it to him without argument. That was the hardest part of the entire process. Not the investigation, not the paperwork, but sitting in my own apartment that night, imagining him driving home to a woman who had no idea her husband now knew everything, including the thing she'd probably assumed no one could ever verify. I texted Marcus to make sure the large transfer stayed frozen under compliance review. Then I sat with a cup of tea I never drank and waited for morning like it owed me something. The next morning, my father called Mr. Alderman directly, without me in the room. I only heard about it afterward, how he'd asked calm, precise questions about the prenup, about how quickly the fraud provision could be invoked, about what voided spousal claim actually meant in practice. Mr. Alderman told me later that my father asked one more question before hanging up. Is there any way to do this without destroying her financially? I still don't want to be a cruel man. Mr. Alderman told him the law would decide the outcome, not either of them. That evening, my father went home and asked Vanessa a single question calmly, the way he negotiates contracts. Who is Daniela Voss? I wasn't there, but he told me later that her face changed before she said a single word. That flicker people get when a lie they've been maintaining suddenly has nowhere left to hide. She tried consulting, then a side project she forgot to mention, then, when he laid the investigator's photos on the counter, she went quiet in a way that told him everything the paperwork already had. And the pregnancy, my father said next, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him, he told me later. Was any of that real? Vanessa didn't answer right away. When she finally did, she said it had been complicated, that she'd been scared to disappoint him, that she'd meant to tell him the truth eventually. My father told me that was the exact moment something in him finished breaking, and something else, colder and clearer, took its place. He didn't raise his voice once. He simply told her to pack a bag for the night. Vanessa's first real move wasn't an apology. It was an accusation. She told my father I had been spying on her out of jealousy, that I'd never accepted her, that this was a smear campaign from a daughter who couldn't stand sharing her father. It might have worked, months earlier, but my father had already seen the signatures in her own handwriting, already heard her own words about the pregnancy from her own mouth. Feelings can be argued with. Confessions can't. She built a fake consulting company off the company Emily's mother helped build, my father told her, his voice steady in a way I'd rarely heard before. That's not something my daughter invented. That's something you signed your name to. And the pregnancy, that's not something Emily invented either. Vanessa's tone shifted from indignant to desperate almost instantly. She started talking about counseling, about how it could all be worked through if he'd just stopped the lawyers. My father told her the lawyers weren't stopping. Not this time. Over the following week, Mr. Alderman formally invoked the fraud clause in the prenuptial agreement, supported by the LLC filings, the frozen transfer records, and a formal statement from Marcus about the pattern of unauthorized payments. Vanessa hired her own attorney, who tried to argue the payments were legitimate business expenses. That argument fell apart the moment discovery revealed the brand consulting retainer invoice had been created and backdated the same week the transfer was flagged for compliance review, a detail her own attorney hadn't known about until it was already filed into evidence. Word moves fast in small business circles, and faster in wealthy social ones. By the time the case was formally underway, Vanessa's name had already started circulating at the same charity. Events where she'd once introduced herself as Mrs. Hartwell. People who'd fawned over her at the wedding suddenly had somewhere else to be when she called. I didn't orchestrate any of that. I didn't have to. Reputation, like money, moves according to its own math once the truth is out. Tyler Reyes, the boyfriend, disappeared from the picture almost immediately once his name surfaced in the fraud filing as an authorized LLC signer. He hired his own lawyer, distanced himself from Vanessa entirely, and reportedly told a mutual friend that he didn't sign up for a fraud case. Vanessa had built her entire plan around two men, my father for the money, Tyler for everything else, and within a month, both of them were gone, for reasons that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the choices she'd made on her own. The company's outside counsel, working with Mr. Alderman, referred the transfer pattern to the district attorney's financial crimes unit, since the amounts and interstate wire transfers met the threshold for a formal fraud investigation. I want to be clear about something here. I never wanted Vanessa in handcuffs. I wanted my father protected, my mother's legacy intact, and the truth on record. But once fraud crosses a certain dollar threshold, it stops being a family matter and becomes a legal one, whether anyone involved wants that or not. Vanessa's attorney tried to negotiate a quiet settlement, restitution in exchange for the company declining to pursue criminal charges. My father considered it, genuinely, because some quiet part of him still didn't want to see her prosecuted. It was Mr. Alderman who reminded him gently that quiet was exactly what had let this happen for 8 months in the first place. My father authorized restitution talks, but made clear the prenup's fraud clause would still be enforced in full, regardless of what she paid back. The restitution negotiation revealed something none of us expected. Vanessa didn't have $180,000 sitting anywhere. She'd already spent most of the diverted funds. Designer bags, a leased Range Rover, a deposit on a condo she'd planned to move into once the marriage ran its course. The woman who'd built her entire plan around extracting wealth had almost none of it left to give back. Her attorney requested a payment plan. Mr. Alderman didn't object. He simply noted, for the record, that the company would take whatever the court allowed, and nothing less. While the legal process moved forward, my father asked me to help him go through the company's finances properly. Not just the fraud, but everything Vanessa had touched since the wedding. It took us 3 long weekends at my parents' old dining table, the same one my mother used to sit at with her own ledgers. At one point, my father put his pen down and said quietly, "Your mother would have caught this in a week." I told him that was probably true, but he'd caught it too, the moment it mattered. Halfway through those weekends, my father's blood pressure spiked badly enough that Grandma Joan insisted on driving him to urgent care herself, worried he'd been pushing through chest tightness for 2 days without telling anyone. It turned out to be stress-related, not cardiac, but the doctor's warning was blunt: slow down, or the next scare might not be a false alarm. I sat with him in the waiting room for 3 hours, and somewhere in that fluorescent-lit silence, I realized how much this had already cost him physically, not just financially. He was released that same evening with instructions to rest, and for the first time since the whole ordeal began, he let himself actually rest. No calls to Mr. Alderman, no late nights with the ledgers, just quiet. Grandma Jones stayed over that week, cooking meals he barely touched, and I came by every evening after work, not to talk about Vanessa, just to sit with him. It was the first time in months our family felt like it was healing, instead of just surviving. The divorce filing came fast once the fraud case was underway. My father didn't wait, didn't hesitate, didn't ask for another one more conversation with Vanessa. Under the terms of the prenup's fraud clause, she was entitled to none of the marital assets she'd been counting on. No share of the house, no share of the company, no spousal support. Her attorney tried to argue the clause was unconscionable. The judge, reviewing the LLC filings and the backdated invoice, disagreed within minutes of the hearing starting. I sat in the back of the courtroom on the day of the ruling, not because I needed to see it happen, but because my father asked me to be there. Vanessa didn't look at either of us when the judge read the decision. She stared straight ahead, the same composed expression she'd worn at her own wedding, except now it looked less like confidence and more like something barely holding together. I felt no satisfaction watching her face. I felt relief that it was finally, formally, over. Outside the courthouse afterward, Vanessa's attorney approached Mr. Alderman one last time, asking if there was any flexibility left to discuss. Mr. Alderman's answer was short. The court already decided. There's nothing left to negotiate. I watched Vanessa get into a car alone. No Tyler, no friends from the old social circle, no one waiting to console her. For a woman who had spent a year surrounding herself with the appearance of an easy, glittering life, the parking lot that afternoon was almost entirely empty. The criminal case moved slower, as these things do. Vanessa eventually accepted a plea agreement, restitution, probation, and a formal fraud conviction on her record, since the wire transfers crossed state lines and met the federal threshold prosecutors had flagged. It wasn't the dramatic courtroom scene people imagine when they hear the word revenge. It was paperwork, hearings, quiet negotiations. But the outcome was exactly what the evidence demanded. She left the marriage with nothing, and left the courthouse with a record that would follow her into every future background check. Within 4 months of the ruling, Vanessa had sold the leased Range Rover back to cover legal fees, lost the condo deposit entirely, and moved in temporarily with a cousin 2 states away. I know this not because I tracked her, but because small towns and small business circles talk, and eventually the story found its way back to us, the same way her lies had found their way to me 8 months earlier. I didn't celebrate it, I just felt the particular quiet of a book finally being closed correctly. A former coworker of Vanessa's, someone from her event consultant days, reached out to Marcus months later, half out of curiosity. Apparently Vanessa had tried something similar once before, a shorter engagement to an older widower, 2 states away that had quietly fallen apart before reaching marriage. Nobody in that circle had ever put the full pattern together, because nobody had ever had a reason, or the skills, to look. I didn't need the confirmation to know I'd been right. But it was strange, hearing that this hadn't been a single mistake. It had been a method. My father, for his part, didn't come out of this bitter. If anything, the experience brought him back to himself in a way grief alone hadn't managed to. He started showing up at the office again, reviewing reports personally instead of skimming them, asking Marcus real questions instead of nodding along. One afternoon, months later, he handed me a folder, not evidence this time, but a formal amendment naming me co-trustee of the company's protective trust, the same role my mother had once held. "I should have made you this a long time ago," he said, sliding the folder across the table. "Not because of what happened, because you've always been the one actually paying attention." I told him I didn't do any of it for a title or a trust. I did it because I couldn't watch someone quietly take apart the thing my mother spent 22 years building, one fraudulent invoice at a time. He nodded, and for the first time in over a year, he looked less like a man who'd been fooled, and more like a man who'd finally come home. Marcus retired the following spring. After nearly 30 years with the company, and at his small retirement dinner, my father stood up and said something I didn't expect. "This company survived because 2 people paid attention when it mattered most," he said, looking at Marcus, then at me. "My late wife built the foundation. These 2 made sure nobody could quietly walk off with it." It wasn't a dramatic speech. It didn't need to be. Some rooms don't require volume to feel important. Grandma Joan summed it up best, months later, over the same kitchen table where she'd first warned me not to wait too long. "You didn't destroy that girl," she said, stirring her coffee. "She destroyed herself. You just kept the receipts." I've thought about that line more than almost anything else from that entire year. I never wanted revenge in the dramatic sense. No public scene, no viral confrontation. I wanted the truth on record, my father protected, and my mother's legacy left exactly as she built it. People sometimes ask me if I regret how quiet the whole process was. No big blow-up, no dramatic showdown at a family dinner. I don't. Loud confrontations get remembered as drama. Quiet, documented, patient work gets remembered as the truth. Vanessa married my father for the bag. She just never accounted for the fact that the family she married into included someone whose entire career was built on finding exactly where the money, And the lies actually went. My father still lives in the same house, though he's slowly making it feel like his own again instead of a stage someone else redecorated. He finally went through my mother's closet last spring, not out of pressure, but because he was ready, on his own terms at last. He kept a few of her scarves and donated the rest to a women's shelter downtown, the kind of gesture my mother would have quietly approved of without ever needing credit for it. He and I have dinner every other Sunday now. No folders, no evidence, just conversation. Sometimes he brings up my mother without me asking, which he never used to do. Last month he told me, almost offhand, "Your mother would be proud of you, not for catching Vanessa, for protecting this family the way she would have. That was worth more to me than any courtroom outcome ever could be." I think often about the version of that year, where I said nothing, where I let the boring job comment slide, where I decided it wasn't my place to look closer at a company that wasn't legally mine yet. In that version, my father loses the company his own father helped him start. He loses his health to stress no one caught early enough. He loses, possibly, everything my mother spent 2 decades building beside him. I'm grateful, every single day, that I chose the other version instead. Vanessa reached out once, nearly a year after the ruling, through a mutual acquaintance, asking if my father would be willing to talk. Just once, no lawyers. He didn't respond. When I asked him about it later, he simply said, "Some conversations don't need to happen for closure to arrive. Mine already did, the day the judge read the ruling." I didn't push him further. Some doors, once they close correctly, are better left closed. The company had its best fiscal year in nearly a decade, the year after the divorce was finalized. Not because business itself changed dramatically, but because the internal reviews I insisted on implementing caught 2 smaller vendor discrepancies before they became real problems. My father jokes now that I audit like other people breathe, and he's not entirely wrong. But it's the reason nobody will ever again quietly walk out of that company with something that isn't theirs. Sometimes, at family dinners now, Grandma Joan tells the story of the wedding planner comment, the one that started all of this, like it's a piece of family folklore, instead of the moment that nearly cost us everything. She said Emily wasn't real family, Grandma Joan will say, shaking her head. And 11 months later, Emily was the only reason there was any family left to protect. My father always laughs at that part. I always let him. I don't think of what I did as revenge, even though that's the word people reach for when they hear the story. Revenge implies I wanted her to suffer for its own sake. What I actually wanted was much simpler. The truth on record, protected by paperwork strong enough that no amount of charm could talk it back into hiding. It just happens that when the truth comes out completely, the person who built their entire life on hiding it usually doesn't have very much left standing. My mother used to say that the people who love you the loudest in public are rarely the ones protecting you the hardest in private. I didn't fully understand that until this year. Vanessa gave beautiful toasts, wore stunning dresses, cried at exactly the right moments in front of exactly the right crowd. I never gave a single toast about my father that entire year. I just made sure that when everything else fell away, he still had a company, a family, and a daughter who'd been paying attention the whole time. If there's one thing I'd want anyone watching this to take away, it's this. Quiet doesn't mean passive, and patient doesn't mean weak. I never raised my voice at Vanessa. Not once. In the entire 11 months I knew her, I didn't need to. Some of the most complete kinds of justice are the ones that never require you to shout only to keep watching. Keep documenting, and keep believing that the truth, given enough time, tends to organize itself into something undeniable. She married my father for the bag. In the end, the bag was the only thing she ever really understood about him, not who he was after grief. Not what he'd built with my mother over 2 decades. Not the family that would end up protecting him precisely because she never bothered to see any of it. She left with nothing but a record, a lesson she never asked for, and the particular kind of silence that follows people who spent their whole life performing for an audience that finally, permanently stopped watching. If this story hit home, make sure you're subscribed. I post a brand new family drama story every single day. You won't want to miss what's coming next.